Winter, early 1944. High above the gray clouds of central Germany, a formation of American B-17s turns for home, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. German fighter pilots once waited for this moment, when the bombers were alone, exhausted, exposed. But this time, something follows them. Sleek, fast, relentless. P-51 Mustangs, still there, even on the return. If you're watching, make sure to subscribe. This story changes the entire war. The fear began there, and it didn't stop. In 1942 and into the first half of 1943, the skies over Western Europe told a very different story than they would a year later. The United States Army Air Forces had arrived in Britain with confidence, doctrine, and machines built for a mission they believed could end the war: daylight strategic bombing. The idea was bold, precise, industrial in focus. Destroy the enemy's factories, fuel systems, rail networks, and aircraft production centers, and Germany would collapse from within. But the reality above 20,000 feet was far harsher. American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators were strong aircraft, durable, heavily armed, and capable of absorbing damage that would tear apart lesser machines. Crews took pride in calling them tough as iron. Yet, toughness alone could not solve the one problem that shaped every daylight mission. They could not defend themselves forever. The Luftwaffe understood this from the beginning. They had spent years shaping a defensive air grid that stretched across occupied Europe. Radar stations, radio intercept posts, fighter command networks, efficiently coordinated to direct German interceptors with remarkable speed. When American bombers crossed the Channel and pushed deeper inland, the Germans saw them long before they arrived. At first, the U.S. attempted to solve the problem with escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning. They were excellent machines in their intended roles. The P-47 was rugged and fast in a dive. The P-38, with its twin booms and long range, performed superbly in the Pacific and North Africa. But Europe was different. The cold, the altitude, the distances, they revealed weaknesses that could not be ignored. By the time the escorts turned back to England, running low on fuel, the bombers still had hundreds of miles of dangerous airspace ahead of them. That stretch of sky had a name among bomber crews: the dead zone. Once the fighters left, German interceptors rose in large formations, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, guided in waves to exhaust the bombers' ammunition, readiness, and nerve. Some attacks came from above, some from below, others from head-on. Bombers could fire back, and they did, but against multiple coordinated assaults, guns alone could not cover every angle. Gun turrets rattled, oxygen masks frosted, vision blurred. It was not just dangerous, it was overwhelming. Losses mounted quickly. On certain missions in mid-1943, entire bomber groups failed to return. Crews that survived often came home with empty seats, a name on a roster erased forever. In the summer and fall of 1943, the situation reached its breaking point. Two missions became symbols of the growing crisis. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, both were deep strikes into Germany's critical ball-bearing and aircraft engine industries, exactly the targets U.S. doctrine prioritized. But without long-range escort, the cost was devastating. On August 17, 1943, in the combined Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, the 8th Air Force lost as many as 1 in 6 bombers. On October 14, 1943, known as Black Thursday, another assault on Schweinfurt ended nearly the same way. Bombers burned across fields, towns, and river valleys. The message was unmistakable. America could not continue daylight bombing without protecting its crews. Inside planning rooms at High Wycombe, Sandriquanfurcule Canaituntrain, in operational headquarters, across Air Force command structure, and within the factories back in the United States, a question grew louder and heavier with every loss. How do you escort the bombers? All the way to the target. And all the way home? The answer would not come easily. It would require engineering, leadership, industrial coordination, and a shift in aerial warfare philosophy. It would require changing the way fighter aircraft were designed, refueled, deployed, and commanded. But change was coming. Because while the Luftwaffe believed the dead zone was permanent, an unbreakable reality of the air war, American designers, pilots, and strategists were already working on something different. Something faster, something lighter, something that could fly farther than any escort fighter before it. A machine built not just to protect bombers, but to hunt the hunters. And when it arrived, the entire balance of air power over Europe would shift. The most urgent problem of the air war was now unmistakable. The bombers needed protection for the entire mission, not halfway, not most of the way, all the way in and all the way back. But in late 1943, this idea still seemed nearly impossible. Fighter aircraft were traditionally designed around a clear set of priorities: speed, maneuverability, climb rate, and firepower. Range was an afterthought. The thinking was simple. Fighters fought where battles were close, fast, and brief. Long-range flight required fuel, and fuel meant weight. Weight meant slower speeds, weaker engines, and reduced combat performance. In the eyes of many engineers and commanders, long-range escort fighters simply did not make sense. So the U.S. tried to solve the problem with what it already had. First came the P-47 Thunderbolt. Strong, heavily armed, and nearly indestructible in a dive, the Thunderbolt was beloved by many pilots. But above 25,000 feet and beyond the Rhine, it struggled to match the agility of German fighters. More importantly, it simply could not travel far enough. Even with additional fuel tanks under its wings, it had to turn back, leaving the bombers in the dead zone every time. Next came the P-38 Lightning. The P-38 had range. On paper, it could go deep into Germany. In the Pacific theater, where airfields were distant and targets were separated by ocean, the P-38 excelled. But Europe's cold, high-altitude winter air caused engine reliability issues. Compressibility problems in high-speed dives made the aircraft difficult to control during evasive maneuvers. Pilots adapted, but adaptation was not enough. To the men in bomber groups, the question had become bitterly simple. Why couldn't anyone build a fighter that could just stay with them? Meanwhile, inside American aircraft development circles, one design sat quietly on test fields, almost overlooked. North American Aviation had originally built it to fulfill a British request. The early versions were unremarkable, decent at low altitude, underpowered at high altitude, and considered unfit for deep escort missions. It was called the P-51 Mustang. As originally configured, the Mustang's engine limited it to lower altitude operations. But the airframe, sleek, aerodynamic, efficient, had untapped potential. The breakthrough came when British engineers suggested pairing the Mustang's airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a power plant with superb high-altitude performance. This was more than a simple engine swap. It was the key. The Merlin transformed the Mustang into something entirely different. A fighter that could maneuver at high altitude, climb fast, and still conserve fuel efficiently over long distances. It could now fight where the bombers flew, and more importantly, it could fly farther than any American escort fighter before it. But even this was not enough on its own. Range required planning, logistics, fuel calculations exact to the minute. Airfields positioned carefully across eastern England, allowing fighters to launch, escort, refuel if needed, and still return safely. American commanders began reorganizing escort doctrine. Fighters would no longer simply escort. They would control the skies. This change in thinking was profound. Before, escort fighters were reactive, waiting to defend bombers from incoming attacks. Now, the idea was aggressive. Seek out the Luftwaffe, break its formations, destroy its ability to attack at all. The Luftwaffe did not yet realize this shift had begun. They still believed the deep intercept zone was theirs, a permanent advantage. The German air defense network assumed the bombers had to face them alone. They did not know that a fighter was coming that could erase the dead zone entirely. Back in England, ground crews inspected the first Merlin-powered Mustangs. Pilots trained to fly them. Strategists studied flight paths and fuel burn charts. Factories began increasing production. Every piece of the puzzle moved quietly, steadily, with purpose. History doesn't always turn with noise. Sometimes it turns with preparation. The change was not visible yet. Not in the skies, not to the Luftwaffe, not to the bomber crews who still watched empty horizons during the return home. But change was coming. And soon, German pilots would look up and see something they had never seen before. American fighters still there, at the target, on the return, and even over Germany itself. The first time the P-51 Mustang appeared in large numbers over Europe, it did not enter with fanfare. It arrived the way true turning points do, quietly, almost modestly, as if it were simply another aircraft joining the war. But those who understood aerodynamics and air combat saw the change immediately. The Mustang was different. Its wings were thin and laminar flowed, engineered to reduce drag. Its body was sleek, shaped to slip cleanly through the air rather than push against it. The bubble canopy later introduced gave pilots clear visibility in every direction, an invaluable advantage in dogfights where a second's warning could mean survival. And its heart, the Merlin engine, gave it life where other fighters struggled, delivering power at the same high altitudes where German interceptors hunted bombers. Yet the true strength of the Mustang was not just its speed or maneuverability, it was its range. With external drop tanks fitted under the wings, simple metal cylinders, cheap to manufacture, thrown away after use, the Mustang could accompany bombers deep into Germany, across targets like Regensburg, Stuttgart, Augsburg, Frankfurt, and Berlin, and then escort them all the way home. This was something new, something the Luftwaffe had never had to face. American air commanders saw what this meant immediately. The dead zone was gone. Not just reduced, not partially covered, completely erased. To make this possible, the United States coordinated one of the most efficient military-industrial networks in the world. Entire airfields across eastern England were reorganized to support constant escort operations. Fuel depots expanded. Maintenance crews learned the Mustang systems in record time. Replacement parts and whole airframes flowed from American factories at a pace Germany simply could not match. This was not simply a technological triumph, it was an industrial one. While Germany's aircraft production strained under bombing, material shortages, and the loss of skilled labor, the United States increased manufacturing every month. For every fighter Germany built, America built several. For every pilot Germany trained, America trained whole squadrons. But tools alone don't win wars. The Mustang needed pilots, and the men who flew it were not just trained. They were prepared for what the mission truly required. Fighter groups like the 354th, the 357th, and the 4th began escort operations in late 1943 and early 1944. The Mustang's presence increased steadily, like a tide rising 1 inch at a time. Then came the moment everyone remembers. A bomber formation returning from deep inside. Germany passed over a landscape where the Luftwaffe once waited with near certainty of victory. But when German pilots climbed to intercept, they did not find unprotected bombers. They found Mustangs. The escorts did not turn back. They did not peel away. They stayed tight, steady, ready. And when the German fighters moved to attack, the Mustangs broke formation and went forward. This was more than escort. This was air dominance. The Luftwaffe's defensive structure, carefully built since 1940, was not designed for this. Their pilots were trained to attack bombers, break formations, and then return to base. They were not prepared to fight an escort fighter that had the speed to overtake them and the fuel to keep chasing them. German pilots reported it with disbelief. The Mustangs did not run out of fuel. They did not leave. They followed them, even on the return home. For the first time in the war, German fighter units began returning to their own airfields, followed by American fighters overhead. The psychological effect was profound. The sky above Germany, once familiar, once defensive territory, was no longer safe. The Mustang had done more than protect the bombers. It had invaded the German sense of control, but the true shift had only begun. Because once American commanders realized the Mustang could go anywhere, they changed their mission from escorting bombers to destroying the Luftwaffe itself, and that would rewrite the air war entirely. By early 1944, the air war over Europe no longer resembled the one fought just months earlier. The moment the P-51 Mustang entered the sky in force, the rhythm of air combat changed. What had once been a predictable sequence, the bombers advancing, escorts turning back, German fighters closing in, was now disrupted. The Luftwaffe had built its defensive strategy around the assumption of absence. But now, the bombers were never alone. The shift was first felt in the bomber formations themselves. Crews who had grown accustomed to watching the sky empty around them, waiting for the direction of the next attack, began to see something different. The Mustangs didn't leave. Even as the groups pushed deep toward targets like Leipzig, Brunswick, and the industrial heart of the Ruhr Valley, the escort fighters remained in formation, positioned just beyond the bomber, stream like watchful guardians. This presence alone altered morale. Gunners who once held their breath at the edge of German airspace now saw the sleek silhouettes of Mustangs gliding alongside them. Pilots no longer braced for the moment the escorts would wave off. Instead, they saw the P-51s adjust throttle, reposition, and continue. The bombers were no longer advancing into the unknown. They were advancing with protection. But while the morale of American crews rose, the psychological weight shifted heavily onto the Luftwaffe. German pilots, many experienced veterans, recognized the change instantly. Their standard interception tactics, the head-on attack, the vertical dive from above, the coordinated wave approach, relied on the bombers being isolated. Every move, from formation timing to fuel planning, depended on striking the bombers after the escorts left. Now the Mustangs shattered that window of vulnerability. German pilots often described the moment in stark terms in post-war accounts. They engaged expecting open space, and instead found American fighters already turning toward them. Instead of bombers caught helpless in formation, they saw Mustangs closing distance, gaining altitude, and pushing aggressively into the fight. The Germans realized they were no longer intercepting bombers. They were entering dogfights on American terms. The P-51's speed sealed the change. At altitude, the Mustang could accelerate faster than the Bf-109 and the FW-190. It could climb rapidly, roll sharply, and retain energy in maneuvers that often cost German fighters critical airspeed. In a fight where a fraction of a second determined survival, these advantages compounded. But the most decisive factor was not speed. It was range. For the first time, German pilots could not disengage by simply breaking away and diving toward their airfields. The Mustangs could pursue. They could chase. They could follow an interceptor all the way back to its base and still return to escort duty. This was the detail that broke predictability. The Luftwaffe had relied on operational safety. Attack, disengage, land, refuel. A system works when it is stable. But once American fighters shadowed them into German airspace, their home skies were no longer secure. Bomber formations soon reported fewer coordinated attacks. German fighter wings began to lose cohesion. Experienced leaders, Gruppenkommandeurs and Staffelkapitän, fell in combat, replaced by newer pilots with less training and fewer flight hours. This wasn't accidental. This was strategy. This was the U.S. Air Force's dismantling the German fighter force one engagement at a time. American commanders recognized that air superiority didn't come from defending bombers. It came from removing the enemy from the sky entirely. And the Mustang was the aircraft that could do it. So the mission changed. The objective evolved. The escorts did not simply guard. They began to hunt. The Luftwaffe, once confident in its ability to contest any airspace over Germany, now found itself reacting, retreating, absorbing losses faster than it could replace pilots or machines. The sky, once a shield for German industry, was slipping away. But the most decisive shift was still ahead, because soon the Mustangs would stop waiting for the Luftwaffe to come to them. They would go find them. By the spring of 1944, the Mustang was no longer just an escort. It had become a predator. The shift in mission was deliberate and strategic. American commanders, including General James Doolittle of the 8th Air Force, understood something crucial. If the Luftwaffe continued to exist as a fighting force, then no matter how many factories were bombed or how many targets were destroyed, the air war would still be contested. Victory required more than protecting bombers. It required breaking the German fighter arm completely. So the order was issued. Escorts are no longer tied to the bomber formation. Once the bombers were safely en route, the Mustangs were free to leave formation, climb, dive, sweep, and seek the enemy on their own terms. This was the turning point, where once the Luftwaffe chose when to engage, now the Americans controlled the fight. German pilots used to climb confidently, knowing bomber formations were predictable targets. Now, they rose into the sky and found nothing but silence at first, until the Mustangs appeared out of the sun, coming down with speed, altitude, and surprise. The hunters had become the hunted. Mustang squadrons began executing high-altitude sweeps far ahead of bomber streams. They struck assembly points where German fighters formed up before attacks. They intercepted enemy aircraft before they reached altitude. Then they pushed further. They began attacking German airfields themselves. Not bombing from high altitude, not sending large formations, but diving, fast and low, directly onto runways, fuel trucks, taxiing aircraft, and fighters taking off or attempting to land, precisely when aircraft were most vulnerable and pilots had the least room to maneuver. There is a certain quiet in war that carries more weight than noise. The moment when an enemy realizes the rules have changed. German fighter groups felt this when Mustangs began circling above their own air bases, waiting. They watched the skies above their runways become danger zones, no longer safe passage, but lethal territory. The Luftwaffe's operational rhythm broke. Fighter wings could no longer time their takeoffs to meet the bombers. They could no longer guarantee safe landing windows. They could no longer train new pilots in the uninterrupted patterns that skill requires because the Mustangs were everywhere. Taui, German pilot returning from a sortie, once described the moment in his post-war testimony. He wrote that he expected to see his home airfield below. Safe, orderly, familiar. Instead, he saw smoke, burning fuel, and what he called silver arrows circling overhead. The airfield staff signaled him to divert, but he couldn't. He was low on fuel. The Mustang saw him. He tried to climb. He didn't make it. This was not a duel. This was systematic removal of the Luftwaffe's ability to fly. The Luftwaffe's pilot training system began to collapse under the pressure. Experienced aces, men with hundreds of sorties, were lost faster than they could be replaced. Their replacements arrived with fewer training hours, less formation discipline, and weaker survival instincts. United States training pipelines, by contrast, were expanding. Aircraft production increased. Replacement rates favored the Allies by wide margins. The attrition curve turned from steep to vertical. As 1944 progressed, the Luftwaffe lost not only machines, but knowledge, those intangible instincts that make air combat effective. Timing, energy patience, spatial judgment, coordinated maneuvering. Meanwhile, the Mustang pilots grew sharper, more confident, more coordinated. They no longer fought to survive. They fought to dominate. Every mission now carried dual purpose: protect the bombers and erase German air strength wherever it appeared. Factories could be rebuilt. Aircraft could be replaced. But pilots, trained, experienced, battle-seasoned pilots, could not. The Mustang was not just winning dogfights. It was dismantling the Luftwaffe as an institution. The German fighter force, once feared across Europe, was now burning fuel faster than refineries could replace it, losing pilots faster than training schools could produce them, and defending skies that were no longer theirs. The skies over Germany were changing, irreversibly, and the collapse was coming next. By the summer of 1944, the German fighter arm was no longer the force that had once claimed dominance over Europe. The Luftwaffe, once feared, disciplined, and strategically precise, was unraveling. And it wasn't a single event that caused the collapse. It was erosion, relentless, cumulative, and impossible to reverse. The pressure from the P-51 Mustang had fractured the core system the Luftwaffe relied on: experience. In the early years of the war, German fighter pilots gained thousands of flight hours. They fought in Spain, Poland, France, and Russia. They refined tactics, sharpened instincts, and rose into the elite ranks. These veterans, their judgment, their timing, their leadership, formed the backbone of the German air defense network. But beginning in early 1944, those pilots began to fall. One by one, mission by mission. Sky by sky. American fighter groups, now operating aggressively and with air superiority, targeted German leaders first. When a formation lost its leader, the cohesion failed. When cohesion failed, survival became guesswork. And in air combat, guesswork is fatal. Meanwhile, Germany's training system could not keep pace. Fuel shortages restricted flight hours. Training sessions were cut short. Simulations replaced real formation drills. The young men entering squadrons had only a fraction of the flight experience their predecessors had taken for granted. The Luftwaffe still issued aircraft, but many of the men flying them were barely trained to survive takeoff. Then came the fuel crisis. By mid-1944, Allied bombing campaigns had begun targeting oil refineries, Ploiești, Leuna, and synthetic fuel plants feeding the German war engine. Without fuel, even the fighters Germany still possessed sat motionless on runways. Some airfields stored aircraft in rows under camouflage netting, unable to fly them. Engines turned only briefly to prevent mechanical seizure, but flights were rare. A fighter is only as dangerous as the fuel in its tank. Germany no longer had fuel, and the Mustangs? They kept coming. Squadrons swept across the skies in layered patrols. Some escorted bombers, some hunted fighters, some roamed, looking for trains, convoys, airfields, and supply lines. Every layer of Luftwaffe operations was exposed. Transport units, training flights, recon aircraft. No segment remained safe. Airfields that once roared with engines now echoed with silence. Hangars were scarred, windows shattered, taxiways blackened from strafing runs. The Luftwaffe tried to move air operations deeper into Germany, but the Mustang's range was simply too great. There was nowhere to hide, and then came the shift that sealed the collapse. German pilots stopped choosing to fight. Not all at once, not openly, but gradually, quietly, instinctively, they began turning away. climbing away, avoiding direct engagements. They still launched. They still flew. But the calculated aggression of earlier years had faded. The risk outweighed the purpose. The skies over Germany no longer favored the defender. American bomber formations grew larger, tighter, more confident. Their missions penetrated deeper into industrial centers, Munich, Dresden, Berlin itself, with Mustang escorts present before, during, and after bombing runs. The psychological reversal was total. The airspace over Germany, once the Luftwaffe's territory, now belonged to the United States. The collapse wasn't simply military. It was psychological. When a pilot looks up and sees his sky is no longer his, the war is already lost. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe existed more in theory than in strength. Aircraft remained on paper. Squadrons existed in name. But the skies told the truth. The force that once controlled European airspace had been broken. Systematically, methodically, irreversibly. And in that sky, the Mustang did more than escort bombers. It reshaped the fate of the war itself. By early 1945, the strategic reality over Europe was clear. The United States commanded the sky. The P-51 Mustang had not simply solved the escort problem, it had dismantled the Luftwaffe's ability to wage air war. Factories could be rebuilt, vehicles could be replaced, but trained pilots and strategic confidence could not. Germany had lost both. With air superiority secured, the Allies gained the freedom to shape the ground war. Troop transports crossed the English Channel under protection. Armored divisions advanced beneath safe skies. Supply lines stretched forward without fear of sudden air attack. Every movement, from reconnaissance flights to paratrooper drops, operated under the umbrella of American control, above. This advantage played a decisive role in the WWII success of D-Day and the subsequent push into Western Europe. The German army, once capable of rapid counterattack, now fought under a sky filled with enemy aircraft. Every attempt to reposition, reinforce, or retreat risked detection and destruction. The Luftwaffe, previously a striking arm of German power, became a memory of what had once been. When historians describe the end of the air war in Europe, they often speak of numbers: aircraft produced, fuel burned, sorties flown, combat losses calculated on charts and tables. But the real shift was human. American bomber crews returned home with fewer empty seats. Mustang pilots flew missions knowing the sky belonged to them. German pilots, those who survived, carried the memory of a war where the air slowly closed around them, leaving no room to maneuver, no safety in retreat. This is the legacy of the P-51 Mustang. Not just a fighter plane, not just an escort, but a strategic instrument that changed the direction of the war. It proved that industrial coordination, engineering innovation, and strategic flexibility could alter what seemed inevitable. It demonstrated that control of the air is not earned through force alone, but through persistence, adaptation, and will. The Mustangs did not win the war by themselves, but without them, the war would have lasted longer, cost more, and ended differently. They escorted the bombers there. They brought them home, and in doing so, they reshaped history at 20,000 feet, where the sky became not just a battlefield, but a turning point in the fate of the world.